This is Join Us in France, episode 89. Hello, I'm Annie, and Join Us in France is a travel podcast about all things French. Today, I'm not going to be talking travel per se. I'm doing more of a dive into something historical that has great significance. It will explain many things that you will see when you travel in France because it marks a turning point in how chivalry worked in France and in many ways the rest of Europe too. This week is the 600th anniversary of the famous Battle of Agincourt or Agincourt. I think that's how you say it in English, which took place in the very north of France on October 26, 1415, not very far from the cities of Arras and Calais. Before I get going with this wonderful story, I have to say thank you to Janet for your donation. You paid for the hosting costs this month, so everybody else should thank you too, because without hosting, nobody would get to download the show. So thank you for your donation, Janet. So, why talk about this one battle in the north of France 600 years ago? One reason is that you may not remember it, but you've probably heard about it before. At least if you've read some Shakespeare and you've seen the play Henry V. Now, I'm going to do something really silly and read a little bit of that play. The play isn't silly. It's me reading Shakespeare that's silly, but oh well, let's try this. So these are words that Henry V was supposed to have spoken to his soldiers at the Battle of Agincourt on October 24th, 1415. This is Act 4, Scene 1. O God of the battles, steel my soldiers' hearts, possess them not with fear, take from them now the saints of reckoning, if the opposed numbers pluck their hearts from them. God, not today, O Lord. Oh, not today. Think not upon the fault my father made in compassing the crown. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I really can't read Shakespeare. But you can see that Henry V sounds very worried about this battle, and for good reason. Now, I told you that I chose this topic because it's the 600th anniversary of this famous battle. And probably being French, I should say infamous, right? Because we lost. But the anniversary is coming up in 2 days if you hear the episode as soon as it's released. The anniversary date is October 26, 2015. And it's really a big deal no matter when you listen because it'll help you understand the main lines of French history a lot better once you know a little bit about what happened there. This was a monumental loss for the French. But you know what they say? You can lose a battle and still win the war? Well, that's exactly what happened. The Battle of Agincourt was a huge loss for the French in the 100-Year War, but they still won the 100-Year War overall. France truly hit bottom in every way in 1415 on that battlefield, and we'll see today some of what happened. I've got to mention Joan of Arc, Jeanne d'Arc, before I go any further, because even though she was only 2 when this battle took place in Agincourt, she had no part in it, obviously. She was born east of Paris, and this was north of Paris, so it was far away, and she had no part in it. It really makes sense to assume that she grew up hearing about that epic loss and that it was probably one of the motivators that led her to seek her unusual path as the liberator of France. But we'll have to talk more about Joan of Arc on another day. But suffice it to say that the Battle of Agincourt was happening around that time, and it probably played a part in her amazing destiny. One thing is for sure, France would not have needed saving before Agincourt. And by the way, it's a bit of a funny name. In French, it's spelled Azincourt with a Z, and in English, it's spelled Agincourt with a G. Are there any tourist tips I can give you around Agincourt? Well, not really. I've never been, to tell you the truth, but I've looked at lots of photos on Flickr and Google, and it doesn't seem like a tourist place. There's a Centre Historique Médiéval, Center for Medieval History, that looks interesting, But Agincourt is not the sort of place where tourists normally flock. It's true, it's an important site for French history, and as a result, there are reenactments and various commemorative activities going on at times. But that's it for most people, you know. Today, it's a small village, unremarkable. There's about 300 people that live there. Flat land, green all the time on account of the rainfall. There are happy cows, lovely people, I'm sure. This year, because of the 600th anniversary, there have been many events. The big 600 years anniversary reenactment took place in July because it's wet and cold in late October, and they didn't want to risk it. The rainy weather actually played a huge part in the battle too, as you'll hear in a minute. The Battle of Agincourt opposed the French to the English as part of this never-ending war called the 100 Years' War, la guerre de Cent Ans in French. It really started in August 1415 when the inhabitants of the French Normandy coast saw 1,500 ships coming across from England. That must have been a formidable sight. Very frightening. There were thousands of men on board, and they were led by the King of England himself, Henry V, who was only 28 years old and had only been king for 2 years. He wanted to prove himself and wanted to take back the lands that used to belong to England as he saw it. France at the time is led by Charles VI, who is known as Le Fou, the crazy one, who reigned for 30 years, and his madness got worse and worse with time. So the French king is weak, and what happens when the king is weak? Well, there are two big factions that fight over power in France. On one side, you have the Bourguignons. On the other side, the Armagnac. Now, Bourgogne is where all the fancy wine comes from, around the Lyon area, and Armagnac is in the southwest, between Toulouse and Bordeaux. Henry V knows that the French king is weak, and he wants to assert what he sees as his right. He wants to start by taking over one French town, Harfleur. That's Harfleur. You can see all of these names spelled out on the website joinusinfrance.com/89. Harfleur is a really important city because it's where the Seine River opens onto the channel, and it's a busy port where goods to and from Paris move. So if you control Harfleur in those days, you could really starve Paris. It was very important. There were around 5,000 inhabitants in Harfleur. It is protected by a wall, but it only had 400 soldiers. Remember, there are 1,500 English coming over, right? Harfleur falls into the hands of the English within a month. No reinforcements were sent by the French king to help Harfleur, probably on account of political strife within the French government, and maybe the king was busy murdering people. He was really crazy. Henry V, he could have decided to move on towards Paris, but he chooses not to. He decides that he wants to winter over in Calais, which already belonged to the English at the time. But getting to Calais from Harfleur was difficult logistically. There were no good roads. There were roads, but not great roads like what we have today, obviously. There's at least one big river to cross, and it's really slow going. And so the English are not in great shape. They are tired, they're starving, they're not in great spirits. While Henry V and his armies make their slow way to Calais, finally, a French army shows up in October, and it shows up with 5 different bosses. And they talk about having a battle. Now, back then, this is how you did war, right? Armies got into proximity of one another, and the leaders held a meeting to agree on the time and place of the fight. Henry V got officially challenged to a battle, and at first he just doesn't want to. He just wants to get to Calais. He tells him, "You're too late. You should have stopped me at Harfleur. I'm on my way. Leave me alone." But a few days later, he changes his mind, and he chooses a gently sloping piece of land surrounded by woods on both sides. near the village of Agincourt. These armies meet in the evening of October the 24th, 1415, 600 years ago, and they fight it out the next day. As we saw, the English are really nervous. They can see that they are outnumbered, and the French are overconfident. That happens to us. You've got 18,000 French on one side, including most of the most gloried knights from rich and famous families. And they're there with their horses and servants and shining armors and battlefield banners and all of that. And the English, well, there's 6,000 of them. 18,000 to 6,000. And the English are mostly men on foot with bows, right? Now you have to understand that French knights, they trained for jousting. They trained to run fast with a fearless horse that can gallop, carrying them and 60 pounds of armor. It's a very specialized skill, right? They know exactly how to lower their lance and the right moment to knock off the other knight. They're unbeatable at that game. The thing is, that's not the game the English came to play. So on paper, there's no way the French should have lost. The French are more numerous. They are in better shape. They are professional trained warriors. They have famous knights among their ranks. You have to imagine the battle with colorful banners and soldiers all night lined up and walking towards one another. The French decided to put the knights on their horses up front. And far behind all of them, you have the foot soldiers with the crossbows. The English don't have very many knights with them, and the knights decide to stay back. And they place hundreds of archers in the front. These archers will turn out to be formidable, very limber, and very effective at taking out the enemy. Also, it rained all night in Agincourt. The ground is wet and very heavy. The assault starts when Henry V orders his men to start shooting arrows by the thousands. The English had also planted stakes in the ground overnight while the French were having, a pleasant evening. And as the French knights tried to move forward with their horses in the heavy mud, many of those horses fell on those stakes to their death. And it must have been horrible to have all these horses slipping and falling and dying, and French knights with so much armor, once they fall in the mud, they can't really get up. It's too heavy. The French are really disorganized. Remember, they came with 5 different bosses? Well, these people didn't necessarily get along either. They are not at all prepared for this sort of situation, and they get beaten very quickly. Now, to tell you the truth, this was not the first time that French chivalry had lost an epic battle to their really old tactics. And there were some knights in the French ranks who had gotten wiser and wanted to fight on foot, but there weren't enough of them to turn things around. On that day in Agincourt, many French knights were taken prisoner, and they could have been exchanged for heavy ransom. But Henry V decides he would rather kill his captives, which is totally against the rules of chivalry, and also the rules of basic greed, because a prisoner is worth a lot of money. But Henry V wants their throats cut. Yes, that's how he wanted it done. We're shocked today when we see news events where people get, their throats cut. Well, 600 years ago, that's how Henry V got rid of most of his enemies. So there you go. The French lose between 5,000 and 7,000 men. Many of them were their best, richest, and most famous kings. The Duke of Orleans is captured but spared, and he will stay a prisoner in England for 25 years. And during those years, he wrote a lot of poems, apparently. The English only lose between 500 and 1,500. So, between 5,000 and 7,000 for the French, 500 and 1,500 for the English. It's a big difference. Crazy French king Charles VII couldn't do anything much about this. He had a strange pathology. He'd be fine one day, and then he'd go on a murderous rampage triggered by crazy ideas. At one point, he thought he was made of glass, and he wouldn't let anybody approach. I suppose if psychiatry got their hands on him today, he might say he was schizophrenic or bipolar or whatever it was. But the one thing you could rely on is that he'd go insane and kill people around him. I mean, he would kill his servants for no reason. He would just pull out a knife and kill them. He did this several times. And with a king like that, and most of his knights dead, France was in a terrible shape after the Battle of Agincourt. There are factions in France, some of them, the Bourguignons especially, like to make alliances with the English king, and the English king is able to take over all of Normandy. The French, they're too busy fighting one another and distrusting one another. Cities fall under the influence of either the Bourguignons or the Armagnac. It's a huge mess. Depending on who makes alliances with whom, territories change hands all the time everywhere in France. It's just, we've mentioned problems with the English in the South of France episodes that we've done, and it was related to all of this. And things go from bad to worse, and 5 years later, in 1420, Charles V, who is now senile as well as crazy, signs an agreement that states that his own son will not succeed him to the throne, but that the French crown will go to Henry V. The Bourgogne factions won the internal disputes and allied with the English, and that's how we got a crazy French king handing over the kingdom to the English. He just signed it over. Henry V died, but his son, Henry VI, was King of England and France. Charles VII, the next French king, and Joan of Arc will change all of that rather quickly, but that's another story for another day. Now, let's talk about a few general lessons that we can learn from this. French people were, and still are in many ways, rigid in their ways. That's just a cultural thing with French people. We do not like change. And that's one of the reasons that we have been able to retain our culture, our language, our gastronomy. You see our neighbors, the Dutch, they start teaching English to their kids when they're very young because they're just practical about this. Dutch children need to speak good English, right? They also learn Dutch, by the way. But in France, we're very rigid. Well, oh, no, we can't have that. French kids need to learn French first. And then maybe when they're older and they can't pronounce it, they try to learn English. So we're just rigid, right? And it helps us when it comes to culture and gastronomy, but it has so many disadvantages. In the case of Agincourt, showing up with knights on horses and 60 pounds of armor, and I'll put a picture on the website so you can see the type of armor. It's not the medieval type of armor. It's they have these plates and not the small chain stuff. Anyway, I'll put a picture. You can see it. So showing up with knights on horses and all that armor, when the English are fighting on foot with archers that can shoot at a distance, well, that was just silly. It was stupid. Now, sure, French knights trained with this armor. They're used to fighting with this heavy stuff on, but it was not appropriate for that particular fight. Not when it's muddy and awful. You get off your horse and fight with maybe some leather protections, but not anything heavy like that. Knights are an old tradition in France, straight out of the songs of the troubadours. They sang of valor and honor and faith, and that's how it was born, right? Out of the imagination of the troubadours. There's documentation of French knights that started around the year 1000. At first, their role was mostly military, at the service of noble landowners. They picked out the tough kids, right? The tall and buff kids, and gave them training and equipment and asked them to protect the area. But then slowly it became a fraternity. Those are the ones we hear about a lot in the movies. They take secret oaths and they go through the accolade and they protect one another. Then after that, later on, the knights became a social class, and the king would favor the sons of his most devoted supporters by giving them a special ceremony. And then knighthood was a genuine institution. And by the time Agincourt came around, that's what it was. It was an institution. It was a habit. It was something that they believed in. Now, the knights were born around the year 1000, and for all practical purposes, they were gone by the French Revolution, so 1700s, late 1700s. Even though by the 1700s, being a knight really did not mean much anymore, anywhere, right? You have to remember that in the Middle Ages, there weren't that many big wars. The knights, they had to prove their stuff by participating in tournaments. And tournament is like a sports competition, but where you can get seriously hurt. You'll find reenactment of those jousting tournaments all over France. When you visit France, there are castles in the summer that put together all sorts of reenactments, and they are wonderful for kids and for adults. You get to see the horsemanship, the battles, the costumes. I really never met a kid, boy or girl, that didn't love those. So if you're in France and you're near a castle that does that sort of summer program, it's worth trying it. It'll probably be in French, unless you're in a truly touristy town. But that's okay. I mean, it's all a pageant, right? It's all something that you watch and enjoy. You don't need to understand every word they say. It's all about the show. There are way too many of these sorts of activities in France for me to list them all. If you're visiting France one of these summers and there's a castle that's still standing where you are, there may be medieval jousts or tournaments going on in the summer. Just check them out and ask at the tourist office where you are if there are some nearby, because they're all over. It's a really common thing. So back to the history of knights in France. By the 1200s and the 1300s, there are orders of knights. The Knight Templars, they are monks who, unlike most monks, were allowed to fight, and they mostly did that in the Holy Land. So they were warrior monks, right? There are many orders of hospitaliers. I couldn't even find a name for that. Hospitaliers? I don't know. But there were many orders of those types of knights. They are also monks, but they specialize in providing health services to the crusaders. So it's like a hospital. They take the injured and the sick, and they take care of them. There are a lot of different knight orders. Many of them are religious and others are secular. And by secular, I mean, you didn't have to be a priest or a monk to join, but really the church became more and more involved in the institution of knighthood as time went by. And I'm really going to show my bias here, but nobody does religious ceremonies like the Catholic Church. They've got the cathedral setting. It's beautiful. They've got the costumes. They got the songs. They have the lighting, the candles, right? They even have the odors, the incense. I mean, they put on an amazing show. And if you're going to be knighted, it's really hard to make it more credible than in the middle of a Catholic mass, right? It worked for the kings forever. And yes, they started holding accolades in the churches. But really, in France, the 1100s were the glory days of the knights. At the time, you could be a knight, but not be of noble blood. What you had to be is very tough, and you had to be a strong person on the battlefield, and you had to buy the right to join one of the orders, which means you had to have a certain level of income. And you could receive the accolade, which is called adoubement in French. I don't think that French tip of the week is going to help you very much, but accolade is adoubement. In reality, it was mostly noble young men and a few women too. I'm reading a book about that. I'll talk about them on another occasion. But the 1100s were the glory days. By the 1400s and the Battle of Agincourt, going to battle as a knight was a terrible idea. Knighthood should have been over, really. I mean, at least that type of battling should have been over. But the knight orders didn't die off right away, even though by Agincourt and at Agincourt, they really lost their relevance. Now, the accolade became something entirely different, but it was still very valuable. It could be given to someone to thank them for their service to the king or the queen. See, the Queen of England, she still gives the accolade to rock stars and movie stars and others she finds worthy. So technically, you could say those orders are still alive and well, but are they really? I mean, they're in books and in movies and they make for a good story, but that's about it. At least in France, if the French president tried to give the accolade to anyone, the whole country would die laughing. Okay, we're just so over it by now. So the Agincourt was really the end of knights in France as an institution, as a credible institution. Joan of Arc, though, she still took on the accoutrements of knighthood. And the whole idea lived on for a very long time. And it will probably continue to live on. You know, you see the popularity of novels such as the Da Vinci Code. Of course it's popular. But the knights were mostly relevant in the 1100s in France. And I will show you on Join Us in France pictures of various different kinds of armor that the knights wore. Because you will see them when you visit museums and castles, and they're beautiful, and I don't know anybody who doesn't enjoy seeing them. At my house, we even have a fake knight helmet that all the little boys who come into the house want to put it on, and I have to not let them because it's dangerous. I mean, it's not made as a toy, it's heavy metal, and it could hurt them. Anyway, I digress. So that's the Battle of Agincourt. It was epic. It was a big loss. It really changed things. This is when France hit bottom in the 100-Year War. And this is when France had to come up with a better way. I mean, they finally had to, you know, when you hit bottom, you're like, okay, I don't have a choice. I have to change. And this is when Joan of Arc appeared and turn things around in a brilliant way. She was a brilliant, inspiring leader for a lot of these people. But we'll talk about her on another occasion. So that's it for the show today. It's a little bit of a shorter show, but I really wanted to talk about this because the anniversary is this week. I know French media is not going to talk about this very much because obviously we lost, and you know, who likes to talk about battles they lost? But it was truly a turning point, and it changed a lot of things in French life. And before I close the show today, I have a favor to ask you. I am redesigning joinusinfrance.com so that the information will be easier to find, and also so that people will understand right off the bat what it is that they are looking at. Now, one of the ways that's very effective to do that is to have testimonials. And many of you have written very nice testimonials already, either as a comment on the Join Us in France page or on the Facebook page, but they're a little bit kind of hidden. I mean, they're hard to see. And you know what would make them very much easier for other people to see would be if I put them on the front page and if I add a picture of you. So if you've already written a very nice note, I will try and find a way to contact you to ask you for the photo. And if you haven't done it already, I would love some, you know, whatever way you want to express your gratitude with a picture of you. That would be very, very helpful. So thank you very much. Talk to you next week. Au revoir. This brings us to the end of another Join Us in France travel podcast. You can leave a comment on the website, follow us on Facebook, or look for @ParisPodcast on Twitter. I put lots of information on Facebook and Twitter that never makes it into the shows. And also, this is a subliminal message. Join the mailing list now, today. You can do that on joinusinfrance.com. Look for the green button. Et c'est tout pour aujourd'hui.